Well, George has been writing important, seminal, prophetic books actually for 40 years. And if people ask me sometimes where I get lots of my best ideas, or at least the few good ones that I have, many of them actually come from George Gilder. George's between George and Michael Novak, I sometimes feel like I'm sort of writing commentary on their work. But George has made seminal contributions in several different areas. And so I initially thought, I think I'll just ask George one question about each of his books. And then I realized, oh, wait, there are 20 of these things. I don't think this is going to be sort of a drag.
20 questions.
Yeah, 20 questions, exactly, sort of desperate. But I do want to introduce you to two of his probably most controversial but also very significant books that he wrote. First in mid-1970s, a book called Sexual Suicide, when he was still single, and he even describes it in some ways as a sort of teenage book, passionate and raw. And then reworked it after he was married into a book in the 1980s called Men and Marriage. This is not a book really it's partially about economics, but it's in many ways a book about the family. This is now a growing area in economics, family and economics. But because many of the most famous economists either were single men or might as well have been single men, economics is a discipline, has very often not treated the family, first of all, as important as it actually is metaphysically, but as important as it is economically. And so George, in the 70s in Sexual Suicide and then Men in Marriage, you talked about the effect, essentially, the sort of predictive effects of the welfare state, in particular on inner city men. And I still remember the sort of way you described this. That it's a welfare state for women and a police state for men, for the poor underclass, as you put it. Essentially, the state standing in for fathers and making them expendable. I talk about this.
Well, I said the man in the inner city was cuckolded by the welfare state. And I actually spent a couple years living right next to the inner city of Albany, New York, and following black families in Albany on Clinton Avenue, and talking to them about the impact of the welfare state on their lives. And it became completely evident that the economic analysis of the impact of the welfare state was completely misconceived, because it failed to recognize that there is any value of leisure time. Still, all the analyses that show that the payments of the welfare state to women, which are almost all to women, can't really affect people's motivations, because they're low payments and they're really inadequate and don't impair incentives. And yet, if you add the leisure time that the woman got, which wasn't always edifying, you got an overwhelming advantage. I mean, the woman could earn just much more money than a man could at a reasonable job available to him, and there was no real need for the man in the family, and the role a man plays in the family is supporting it. And this is a primal role, it's a perpetual role, and when it's usurped by the welfare state, it destroys families, as I predicted, and it did destroy the black. We managed to destroy the black family in America. It was an amazing feat, but if we'd systematically attempted to do it, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote about the problem back in whenever it was, there were 25% of black kids were brought up without fathers, and now it's close to 80%, and it's just a tragic event that was predictable, because I did predict it, and we did it, and we did it in a spirit of supposed beneficence, but also with a kind of tumorous growth of the welfare state, where, as Moynihan used to put it, you feed the horse in Central Park, you feed the horses in order to feed the pigeons.
I mean, this is sort of depressing. I didn't mean to start this on a depressing note, but this is actually, we're going to sort of move up from this. But how was this met? How was this argument met? Was it, did you get any sort of leading prizes for this, this argument?
Well, in 1971, was it? I was made Pig of the Year by the National Organization for Women. And I'd been brought up in a farm, and I thought, a Pig of the Year, what a pride. I was just reveled in it. I went around and told everybody I was Pig of the Year, and I had such a good time that I retired the trophy. I was the very last person ever to receive the Pig of the Year trophy. However, they didn't actually give me a trophy, but on my 50th birthday, my family contrived a beautiful brass Pig of the Year trophy for me. So I've got one in my house up in the Berkshires.
Well, so your sort of first few books, I didn't mention Invisible Man, which was also in there, was really
That's
about,
the one in Clinton Avenue.
That's right. All
favorite.
of which sort of come together in the Men in Marriage. If you're going to read something from this time, try to find a copy of Men in Marriage. In fact,
it's in print. I get royalties still from Men in Marriage.
That's right. And Terry Teachout, I think, when it came out in its new edition in '87, he quoted Orwell. He says the sort of importance of the book is inversely proportional to your ability to find it, but actually it continues in print, and you can actually get it online. Sexual Suicide, if you have a copy of that on original edition, that's very difficult to find. But then you turned, in some ways, not from this question of poverty, but to this question of wealth, and had this very important book that Father Spitzer mentioned, which was very widely quoted in Ronald Reagan's speeches. Reagan himself read it and essentially required many other people around him to read it. People probably don't know, though, that Ayn Rand dedicated her last speech, the last speech of her life, to a tirade against your argument in Men in Marriage having to do with entrepreneurs.
I wouldn't say tirade.
Just a critique. Yeah, a critique. What was her beef with your argument in Wealth and Poverty?
Well, she was fixated on the term altruism and was insisted that selfishness was a positive driving force of economics. And so I've said capitalism was based on altruism, that entrepreneurs had to begin by foregoing their own gratifications to save. They then had to collaborate with others to launch a new company that would succeed or fail entirely dependent on the responses of others, on their imaginative response to the needs of others. So I had a different model of capitalism, and I think which also led to knowledge and power. Yes. I don't think capitalism is chiefly an incentive system, and if you consider it as chiefly an incentive system, you're going to misunderstand what's going on. Yet all the mathematical models of capitalism essentially conceive of workers and producers as operating in a Skinner box, responding to rewards and punishments as if they're almost a mechanism. And this is what really disparages the dignity of labor and enterprise and human minds, is the idea that economics is a matter of carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments, a model of psychology that Skinner launched at Harvard or whatever, but which has been entirely abandoned by psychologists,
right,
but clutched by economists to this day. And it leads to the idea that greed has something to do with capitalism. and and so the whole that is positive for capitalism. But capitalism is not an incentive system. It is an information system.
Okay, so you're getting
Yeah.
20 years ahead here. So
Yeah.
I know that George, when he reissued Wealth and Poverty for Regnery, started working on what were essentially marginalia that became his recent book, Knowledge and Power, which we're going to get to. And so he's wanting to get to that, but I want to stay in Wealth and Poverty here for a minute. Because there's this very important argument that I think people don't get. They hear, I was the same way. I read Atlas Shrugged in college. I had read Adam Smith in light of Atlas Shrugged, which is a very dumb thing to do. Eventually figured it out. And then read Wealth and Poverty and found this analysis that later I realized how important the analysis was. There's a famous sort of a discussion that Pope Benedict XVI makes, the difference between, in his analysis, on the one hand, a sort of exchange, right, in which we have a mutually beneficial exchange. I expect a specific thing from you, and we each get it. It's beneficial, but it's not the same thing as a gift. A gift is something that you give with no expectation of return. And you argue in Wealth and Poverty that there's actually this third thing, and maybe we'll call it enterprise, that's not exchange. It's not a pure gift in the sense that the entrepreneur expects something in return but doesn't know what it's going to be, but nevertheless has to give before he can get. In fact, you have this amazing analysis of the potlatch and the trading of gifts between Polynesian tribes. Talk a bit about that.
Well, it's just the investor and the entrepreneur have to give before they can get. That's the principle of capitalism. They don't, socialism, all the returns are pre-specified. And if you could really predict the future, then if the future was really just a deterministic expression of the past, then you wouldn't need human creativity. But creativity, as Albert Hirschman put it, always comes as a surprise to us. If it didn't, we wouldn't need it.
Yeah.
And socialism would work. But because the future is unknown, entrepreneurs have to give before they can't pre-specify their returns. Their returns are unpredictable and dependent on the responses of others, and thus on their own imaginative vision of the needs of others. Well, so it's altruistic in as much as altruism means oriented toward the needs of others.
And that's the word is from the Latin word alter, meaning other. And I think this is the thing. Rand understood altruism as acting for the benefit of the other at your own expense, which is, of course, a different point. That's also a virtue of self-sacrifice. She didn't conceive of the entrepreneurial altruist who acts in a way that may benefit him or her in the future, but nevertheless, if he succeeds, it's because he is oriented toward the needs of the other.
I always felt that this idea of, people do sacrifice their lives. My father lost his life in the Second World War. He almost deliberately sacrificed his life for my future or whatever. But in general, most behavior expects some sort of return in the future, some sort of gratification, even if possibly in another world. It's the idea of this totally selfless behavior is almost self-contradictory.
Yeah, right. Even the golden rule itself presupposes do unto others as you would do unto you, that there's a legitimate domain of interest. If your conscience is properly formed, as the ethicists remind us, you can use how you ought to be treated as a guide to determine how to treat other people. And I think this is a lot of the misconceptions that Christians, including Catholics, have about the nature of the market economy comes down actually to this basic confusion. And so that's why I wanted to spend a few minutes on it. So let's transition to this very important book, Knowledge and Power. And we've known each other now for over 20 years. In fact, I met you in 1998 in person, actually, at the Telecosm conference, the one that Ray Kurzweil attended and spoke at. And you have emphasized for a long time the role and the importance of information theory, but it was not until this book, Knowledge and Power, that you brought together a sort of a completely new theory of the market economy and of capitalism in terms of information. And this is, in fact, my two most recent books have been in part, I think, in some ways, an attempt to sort of translate some of your key arguments. But first, let's talk a little bit about, if you had to distill Knowledge and Power into 30 seconds for someone, what would you say the book is about? Is it something like wealth is knowledge, or something else?
Well, that's a good start. Wealth is knowledge. And we know this because, as Thomas Sowell used to say, the Neanderthal in his cave had all the same material resources we have today. The conservation of matter means that no new resources. All the difference between our age and the Stone Age is the increase in knowledge. And from this proposition, I conclude that the key to capitalism and all economic growth, for that matter, is learning. And I spent a lot of time studying learning curves of various kinds, including Moore's law in the semiconductor industry that shows that computer technology essentially doubles in efficiency every couple years with every doubling of total output. And learning curves are the most thoroughly documented phenomenon in all business strategy. I mean, both the Boston Consulting Group and Bain and Company were both founded on learning curves. With every doubling of total units produced, the cost dropped between 20 and 30%. And this, these consultancies documented these learning curves all across the economy, from egg production to lines of software code to transistors to insurance policy, dollars to, it was, it's the most documented phenomenon. And this led me to the conclusion, this is not a coincidence. Economic growth is learning, period. It's learning. And and what are the conditions of learning? The key condition of learning really is that you can fail. It's falsifiable. It's Popperian. You can be disproven. And so any guaranteed outcomes prohibit learning. Capitalism works because every business is the entrepreneurial test of an idea that can fail, that can go bankrupt. And it's openness to the future that makes learning possible. And when governments guarantee outcomes, they prohibit learning. Thus, they prohibit growth. And this insight seems sort of gratuitous, maybe, but the fact is, all kinds of policies can be, and policy failures can be explained by the effort of government to guarantee outcomes. If you guarantee outcomes, you prevent this learning process that constitutes economic growth. You have guaranteed loans for students, and you essentially render they aren't loans. They're gifts to banks, is what they are, because you can't, because if the loan can't go bad, it's not a loan. No. And if a guarantee to any business, ethanol, whatever it is, just guarantees that economic growth will be halted by that policy.
I mean, this is essentially the story of the financial crisis.
Yeah, the
2008,
financial
right?
crisis was all trying to guarantee everything, and which meant that and the whole economy was steered into these guaranteed securities that couldn't go bad. They were all insured and completely, and as a result, the whole world economy went off a cliff because of the failure to understand that the future is intrinsically unknown to us, and any kind of policy that tries to guarantee it is going to merely stifle the creativity in the image of our Creator that is the key characteristic of human beings in the world.
Well, this touches on another critique. You start, I think, in Knowledge and Power. You've written copiously about the importance of finance and the role of finance in the learning curve and wealth creation, so that you're not a finance skeptic that thinks money itself is simply an epiphenomenon of the economy. Nevertheless, you've decried what you call the sort of hypertrophy of the financialization of money. We've got this something like a $5 trillion a day currency trading thing going. Why is this a problem?
Well, when you don't have, money is something real. And it translates scarcity, real scarcities of the world into the economy. And when and the real money was gold for 300 years or so. The great efflorescence of capitalism and wealth across the world was an effect in part of the gold standard, which was really as much Isaac Newton's great contribution as the calculus and the basic laws of physics. Isaac Newton was master of the mint during the period when the British established the gold standard, and the British Empire miraculously and unpredictably became dominant across the entire world from this little island. And this was really the gold standard. And I've tried to figure out why the gold standard was so incredibly effective. And the real insight I got from Jude Wanniski, actually, who was a writer for the Wall Street Journal, Primitive Education in Las Vegas, but he did see that the key to the success of the gold standard was that it wasn't self-referential. In other words, it didn't measure economic growth with a self-referential unit. It deleted capital and technology. It canceled capital and technology, because as the equipment for extracting gold improved over the centuries, the gold to be extracted became more and more difficult to find from more attenuated lodes and deeper beneath the earth. And so the result was that gold canceled capital and technology and became an expression of the time it took to extract it, which changed very little, if at all, during centuries of technological advance. So, and when you think of it, what remains scarce when everything else remains abundant? Time. Time is the ultimate scarcity that rules all our lives and all economies. And money is something real. It reflects the scarcity of time that governs all economic decisions. And when central banks can just manipulate it at will. They're falsifying time, and thus they are deceiving entrepreneurs and undermining the learning process that, as we understand, generates all economic growth and progress.
So this is essentially then, to use your metaphor, knowledge and power, central banks are throwing noise in the signal of global trade. Through these
Well, I mean,
manipulations.
now people say that Bitcoin and stuff like this is wasteful, but today, every 24 hours is 11 big banks, essentially, together with central banks, conduct some $5.1 trillion of currency trading every 24 hours. That's 25 times all global GDP. It's nearly 75 times all global trade in goods and services every 24 hours. And it doesn't even arrive at subtle currency values that reflect the real scarcities of the world, that reflect the essential scarcity of time that actually is manifested in all measuring sticks across, well, I can go ahead. The measuring sticks that make possible trade are, the meter, the second, the watt, the ampere, the Kelvin, degree Kelvin, all these measuring sticks, Système International in Paris roots each of these measuring sticks in a physical constant. And when you actually scrutinize these physical constants, they all come down to the speed of light and time. They're all a frequency of some sort. And they root the measuring sticks, physical measuring sticks that make possible trade across the world and in components and goods and services, are all ultimately rooted in the scarcity of time. And I believe money is just as real as the meter or the second or any of these others. And its value is real because it's rooted to the degree that it's rooted in the residual scarcity of time.
Well, so
that's my money theory that goes with wealth is knowledge, growth is learning, economic growth is learning, and money is essentially time.
And if you're curious about that, another book that I'm skipping over is called The Scandal of Money, which came in another very recent book.
I also do it in Life After Google.
That's right. And that's a perfect segue into Life After Google, actually, which is your brand new book. And I want to tell people that maybe don't know your work, the sort of record that you have had in predicting trends and noticing trends sometimes not just 5 years out, but 20 years out. Your book Microcosm. In fact, I think your book Microcosm in many ways made Moore's Law sort of a household term that people that at least follow economics have heard of. Your book Telecosm, Knowledge and Power, and now this book Life After Google. The one that I skipped there was a 1990 book called Life After Television. And this was a book that when it was written, some people, I think they thought you were crazy. This idea that,
I can do my little rough.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Life After Television. I said the computer of the future would be as portable as your watch, as personal as your wallet. It would recognize speech. It would navigate streets. It would collect your news and your mail. It just might not do windows, but it would do doors, open doors to your future. Anyway, that was Steve Jobs liked that book and passed it around. So I think I had some inspirational role in.
Oh, if only to have monetized it in some way. But so this is 1990, and so George also predicts many of the things that we're encountering now with streaming video and many of these things. So I want you to know that when we talk about Life After Google, because you see from the title that George is predicting that there's something flawed, both in what, George, you called Google's world system, the kind of view of the world that they have, and also in their business model. I think that's what's so significant about this book. And again, I don't know if what you're predicting is something that's on a 5-year or a 10 or a 20-year timeline, but you talk about in this book are a couple of sort of staggering references that you make. I looked up Google's market cap today. So this is a company, remember, that started in 1998, had a phenomenal growth in the first 10 years. The market cap this morning for Alphabet it's 806 billion, but it's gotten up to about 806 billion. It's been up to 900 billion. It'll be a $1 trillion company probably before long, just behind Apple. And
Amazon.
And Amazon, yeah. And you're predicting its imminent demise. And in fact, this great, sort of gem of American capitalism. You talk about Google Marxism and the Marxists at Google. What are you talking about there?
Well, a lot of people misunderstand what Marx's real error was. And Marx's real error was to imagine that the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was kind of a final human accomplishment, a kind of eschaton, that in the future, the production of wealth would no longer be a concern. That problem had been solved. So that in the future, we would just be concerned with distributing wealth. And that was Marx's error. He imagined that the Industrial Revolution was a final achievement. And and he actually had this image of this great industrial capability enabling people to retire as sort of country squires. He imagined the dignity of labor really being comprised in being able to be a farmer in the morning, a critic in the afternoon, and in the evening be a musician. And that this was his real vision of the future enabled by the Industrial Revolution when wealth was when the proletariat could distribute the wealth all. So, and Google's making the same mistake today. It's saying that the technologies of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, big data, cloud computing, algorithmic biology, that this is the final human attainment. It's even greater than the Industrial Revolution because it eclipses not only human bodies and physical labor, but human minds, and that in the future we'll all be able to retire to the beach, receiving a guaranteed annual income, which is the current fashion in Silicon Valley. And while Brin and Page and Elon Musk and all the other tycoons fly off to nearby planets and
smoke
rockets
bombs, right?
and in a winner-take-all universe.
Yeah.
And this is really Google's vision. I mean, they believe in a singularity, and they'll earnestly argue that big data is something fundamentally new, way beyond mere human minds, and that it will produce answers that are complete and satisfactory in conjunction with machine learning, but will be incomprehensible to mere humans, as our own cerebrations are to our dogs. And that really is the vision. And they think it's pretty inexorable, and they have alarmist meetings about how artificial intelligence is the biggest threat to human beings, more dangerous than nuclear weapons, and as Elon Musk put it, it's the most, and Stephen Hawking, the most devastating development in the history of the human race. I mean, these are the words they use, and they're totally delusional. They have no idea what their technology does and what its potential is. It doesn't even remotely compete with human minds. Everything in it is dependent on human minds and human inputs. They talk about translators sort of can be obsoleted by Google Translate, for example. But all of the Google Translate comes from human translators that the machines assemble. It's just, and it's fundamentally, in principle, impossible for artificial intelligence to usurp minds. That Ray Kurzweil did a book, How to Create a Mind, and it's a fascinating book. It's excellent exposition of how to make an effective translating machine. It says consciousness. Well, we don't quite know what consciousness is. Consciousness is presumably an epiphenomenon of our very fast computing. And we can explain very fast computing, but consciousness we can't. It's somehow an emergent phenomenon. And as our computers get smarter, they'll become conscious magically. But the fact is that thinking doesn't produce consciousness. Consciousness produces thinking. And so lots of people have, Charles Peirce saw this a century ago.
Harvard philosopher.
Yeah, a great American philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, P-E-I-R-C-E, talked about how there's no natural connection between an object and a symbol. Binary logic is intrinsically dependent on outside human imagination and interpretation. He had a triadic logic, and it's intrinsically impossible for a binary system to think. But there's lots of similar insights that have been produced over the years that show that these great computer scientists of Silicon Valley don't have any idea what they're doing. But Chesterton knew about that.
He knew it exactly.
He said the expert does not see more and more of his own field as he delves deeper into it. He tends to see less and less.
Narrower and narrower. George, you're doing what Peter Robinson did in his recent interview with you at National Review Online. And he said very, very often when you're writing these technology books, I think many people, there's sort of two parallel messages, two parallel things you're doing. One is analysis of trends in technology. Another is, he says, well, not exactly theology, but something like the metaphysics, or what is fundamental reality like, and how does this technology help disclose it? And you're doing that here. And so the very people who spend their lives developing these amazing technologies, Google search is an amazing technology, themselves do not understand the fundamental metaphysical issues at stake in the question. And so that's what I think you're doing, is you're diagnosing that that's a weird disparity. It's very strange to people. How could these guys study this? But the same thing happens in biology. The very guys who see the most remarkable designs in all of nature are sometimes the most blind to what's right in front of their eyes. But I want to bring this back down to the ground with Google, because you argue that there's something fundamentally flawed in their business model. And in fact, you say that this idea of free goods and services, which is how we picture and how we perceive Google and Facebook as giving us all these free services, that it's fundamentally a lie. It's not truly free.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really worried about these companies. They are the most valuable companies on the face of the earth. In 10 years, the 4 top companies in the world in market cap moved. In 2008, they were Walmart, Exxon, China Petroleum, and China Commercial and Industrial Bank. 10 years later, in 2018, it's Amazon, Apple, Google, and Microsoft. And this is a tremendous upset. It's an amazing feat. But these American companies have focused on gaining huge market share at a tremendous pace by giving away their goods and services for free. And when you give away your goods and services for free, you avoid the learning process that derives from incurring specific liabilities to customers and responding to the price signals in the marketplace. All this is very edifying and useful. And I've just come back from China, where I launched the book in China, where it's very exciting. These Chinese companies, Tencent, Alibaba, ByteDance, amazing new one called ByteDance, and Baidu, 4 of these, they get only a small proportion of their income from advertising. And they don't do free goods. They've really pioneered all sorts of ingenious payment systems. And I think they have a more stable and sustainable business plan than these American companies that have except for Amazon,
Right, Amazon.
And Apple, that essentially give their goods and services away for free and then depend on advertising, ads, to fund them. And we all know that ads aren't really ads, and on the internet, they're minuses. They're value subtracted. And to have your whole business plan, 95% of your revenues come from ads that people don't want, and that are really a problem on mobile phones, on smartphones. Ads, 30% of the money you pay for your smartphone bill is consumed by advertisements that you didn't want, which in turn slowed down your phone by a significant degree, and only 0.03% of ads on smartphones are actually clicked on, often by mistake. And this 0.03% click rate is really suitable for a Nigerian prince who wants to sell you a tremendous gold mine in Africa.
Yeah.
But it really is not a business plan that can sustain Google and Facebook. So I think Washington is really in a delusional state today, like Silicon Valley. Washington imagines these companies are giant monopolies that control everything and can throw elections, and all these claims that I think are just wrong. These guys don't. They are not, Zuckerberg and Brennan Page are not manipulating searches and timelines in order to favor one candidate or another. That's just not their mentality or their business.
They may love to do so, but your prediction is that, and this is true with Microsoft, just as when Microsoft started suffering from Washington, D.C. for supposedly monopolistic practices, was precisely when they started losing market share. And I don't want us to run out the clock without you being able to give the punchline. You argue that there's a sort of new architecture of the world economy coming, just like you predicted in microcosm and telecosm and life after television. You argue that what you have coined the cryptocosm and blockchain and related technologies are going to be the thing or the things that ultimately upend the current state. Can you distill that for us briefly?
Well, the great giving away free goods is a good way to avoid having really acute security concerns. You can avoid security to a great extent if your goods are free. Who wants to steal a free good? So one of the problems of the existing internet architecture is that it's a porous pyramid, it's insecure, and all the money and power and data rises to the top. And this is, but centralization turns out not to be safe. And so the whole current internet architecture is going to have to be replaced with an internet architecture that affords security and accords with the distribution of human minds. And that new architecture is arriving. It goes under the name the blockchain, which is sort of a proxy for thousands of new companies that are introducing new internet architectures and new goods and services of amazing variety and ingenuity that directly address the key problem of Silicon Valley, which is security. The rule of the blockchain is security first, rather than communications first. And it allows you to retrieve control of your information, your data, your identity. And rather than having to adapt to prove your identity in different ways to each of the millions of web pages where you might want to transact across the internet, instead, you have one identity on the blockchain, and the web pages, each one uses the identity that you supply. You know who you are, and you're in control of. And this is a distributed mode of security. Attacking any single place doesn't yield you any gain.
Right, and the
So it is a new security architecture that's based also on individual human identity and dignity, and
George,
thus is a big advance for the cause of this conference.
In fact, I thought let's end with that, because let's bring this back to the individual. You have in the book, you talk about if you imagined information technology and network technology as pushing human beings and the significance of individuals out to the edge, you say in the book, you said, security is not a procedure or mechanism, it's an architecture. The cryptocosm will start by defining the ground state. It is the ultimate non-random reality. The ground state is you. Yeah. What do you mean?
Well, on the blockchain, your identity is embodied in a private key that I've consider analogically to your own DNA, and you only have a single identity. You know, the internet wants you to have a different username and password and maybe different mother's maiden name or whatever.
And avatars, yeah.
And avatars, and that really didn't work. This idea that you could have good human behavior with no identities. Mm-hmm. And the blockchain really restores individual identities to the net and to this great new way of having a global money, a global marketplace, a global arena of creativity and achievement, and in imitation of, or in the image of the Creator.
Let's thank George Gilder.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you.